The MP, who asked not to be identified to share their concerns freely, said it's clear the US and Israel are, quote-unquote, not following the UN Charter rules or international law, end quote, but Carney is likely, quote, very nervous about saying something that would get the ire of President Trump, end quote. That's a Liberal MP that is saying this, folks. Criticism of Mark Carney's flip-flopping on the military strikes against Iran isn't just coming from conservatives. Liberal MPs are now openly saying they are unhappy with the Prime Minister's response, while media outlets around the world are running scathing headlines about Mark Carney and his so-called leadership, even calling into question the vision he laid out in his Davos speech. It seems the world stage he is constantly jetting off to may not be the safe haven he thought it once was. Let's take a look. So, ladies and gentlemen, just want to bring everybody right back to the statement that Mark Carney put out on February 28th of 2026, right after news broke that the United States and Israel launched their first strikes on Iran. Going right down to the bottom, he says, Canada supports the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to prevent its regime from further threatening international peace and security. So, there's nothing ambiguous about there. We support the United States and Israel. Off we go. Well, then he said this.
We support efforts to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to prevent its regime from further threatening international peace and security. Because Canada is taking the world as it is, not passively waiting for a world we wish to be. We do, however, take this position with regret because the current conflict is another example of the failure of the international order.
So, originally, we support everything. Now, we support it with regret. It's a failure of the international order, Donald Trump's fault. That's kind of what he's trying to say there. So, one is fairly opposite to the other. Okay, fine. So, Mr. Carney, are you going to be helping militarily or not? Now, in this press conference, he said, well, you know, we weren't consulted. We weren't consulted. We weren't advised. We didn't even know. And Anita Anand went on to say this.
First and foremost, Canada wasn't involved, we weren't notified, and we do not have an intention to be involved in any military strikes or operation.
Okay, that's pretty clear. We're not going to be involved in a military operation going forward. So, we've flipped because we were U.S. bad, U.S. always bad. We need to get away from the U.S., elbows up. Legs up, whatever you want. And then we flopped when he said, oh, well, you know, we take this with regret. And Anita Anand stayed with the flop and said, okay, we're not getting involved militarily. But now we're back to the flip, folks. Check this out. Carney won't rule out Canadian military involvement in the Middle East. This is from the Globe and Mail. Prime Minister Mark Carney has left the door open to military deployment as part of the widening conflict in the Middle East if circumstances warrant. He suggested, however, that these would be extraordinary circumstances aimed at supporting allies or defending Canadians and gave no indication any operations are under development. So supporting allies like our allies in the United States? Maybe those types of allies? So we're not going to get involved to, well, you know, we're not going to say no. Well, we're not going to say no anymore. We did say no, but we're not going to say no now. So here's the issue. Because Mark Carney and his cabinet can't decide if they're coming or going up or down or left or right, everybody else is left very confused as to what the heck that they're doing. And people are now starting to voice their concerns about this, even across the world. So this isn't Pierre Poilievre. This isn't Andrew Scheer. This isn't any of the other conservatives. This isn't the National Post, and this isn't the Toronto Sun. So the Liberals can't blame any of these people. We're going to be looking at some outlets around the world that are now commenting on this and weighing in on Mark Carney. So this is from The Telegraph in the UK. Carney U-turns on support for Trump's Iran strikes. After initially backing US attacks on Iran, Canadian Prime Minister says they are, quote-unquote, inconsistent with international law. Mr. Carney's comments on Wednesday morning came after his initial support for the war, expressed in the immediate aftermath of the strikes. His statement on Sunday read, quote, Canada supports the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to prevent its regime from further threatening international peace and security, end quote. The Canadian leader rode back slightly on Tuesday, calling for de-escalation and saying he supported the strikes with regret, quote unquote. He appeared to commit a full U-turn when speaking in Australia on Wednesday morning, describing the conflict as a, quote, failure of the international order, end quote. Here's another publication in Australia. Supporting quote-unquote illegal aggression against Iran, the worst thing Australia could do, international law experts say. Bensall says rolling over after Israel and U.S. attack is counterproductive for middle powers because it undermines rules-based order. And this article also criticizes the fact that Mark Carney and Australia took kind of the same approach here. Here's another publication. Australia's shameless support for the U.S. attack on Iran makes us gullible, duplicitous, or both. Alan Bem. The ease and speed with which Australia, along with Britain and Canada, fell in behind Donald Trump's attack on Iran was startling. For a country that is constantly trumpeting the essentiality of the international rules-based order and preserving global peace and stability, Australia is shameless in its ability to slide into the American slipstream. Here's a French-based paper out of Montreal. Carney's Iranian blunder. The Prime Minister wanted to distinguish himself by quickly supporting the American strikes in Iran. A very bad idea. For many, Mr. Carney's response clashes sharply with the spirit of the now famous Davos speech, which some interpreted as a declaration of independence or even open distrust of the Trump administration. For me, this is a rather naive reading of the speech, whose main weakness is precisely that it leaves unresolved the difficult questions about the relationship between principles and pragmatism. Mr. Carney did not announce in Davos that he had discovered a way to circumvent the hegemonic power of the United States. He didn't even mention the United States by name. At best, he conceded to the great powers the space they claim for themselves while offering a few outlines of rules according to which middle powers could organize ad hoc coalitions as the situation demands. The Carney who said he supported, quote-unquote, with regret, an American military action that seems contrary to international law is the Carney who understood late in life how little he controls the morality of a power that he cannot constrain. And this is from the Canadian press. Because now we have Liberal MPs challenging Prime Minister Carney's stance on the strikes on Iran in the first place. Liberal MP challenges PM stance on strikes on Iran as Fed sidestep legality issue. So you have these publications around the world criticizing Mark Carney and the other countries that took the same stance as it, right after he said, oh, well, we need to resist all these hegemonic powers. Don't pay attention to the fact that I just signed one with China. So this is the issue, because you have a lot of left-leaning publications around the world now coming after Carney, despite his flip-flop, because he's damaged that trust. Well, I just have one thing to say to these world publications. Welcome to the club of the Liberal government in Canada, where the Liberal government has lost so much trust with the Canadian people and is now starting to lose trust with the left-leaning folks inside Canada as well, because nobody knows what's going on. So, what happened with this? Well,
we asked Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand whether what we saw over the weekend complied with international law, and we didn't really get a clear answer. The answer was sort of, Canada prefers diplomacy, but it didn't actually get to the yes or no of whether this follows international law. So we saw on Sunday Will Graves had put out a video sort of questioning what we've heard so far from Ottawa. Will Graves is a Victoria MP. He used to be a professor at the University of Victoria specializing in international relations. And he said that this sort of statement of support for the US does not reflect Canadian interests. He said that Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech at Davos in February had talked about not going along with hegemons, sort of having our own foreign policy, and how this statement on Iran seemed to be going along with America's aims. He said that we can't just be kidnapping or assassinating heads of governments. And what we saw was support from other Liberal MPs on that post, most notably Stephen Guilbeault, the former Environment Minister. We also had the Health Minister. Her account had liked it, but her office said that was actually a mistake, and about 4 other backbench MPs.
So you're starting to see Liberal MPs starting to publicly speak out about this. Greaves is a Liberal MP, and he is out of Victoria, as was mentioned. And he put out a video on Instagram and Facebook and everything where he says, listen, we had this Davos speech, and I agree with it. I think it's great. But then he goes and does this. So what the heck is going on? This is not in Canadian interest. And then he says, well, you know, for my constituents, I need to listen to them, and I'm going to keep advocating for Canadian interests and the fact that we shouldn't be supporting violence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not all the information we have about this. A Liberal member of Parliament has challenged Prime Minister Mark Carney's endorsement of American and Israeli military strikes on Iran as the government sidestepped questions about whether the campaign violates international law. Victoria MP Will Greaves expressed concerns about Canada's stance in a social media post on Saturday, which has since garnered likes from a handful of fellow Liberals, including a former cabinet minister. Quote, Canada cannot endorse the unilateral and illegal use of military force, the killing of civilians, or the kidnap and assassination of foreign heads of government, while also insisting that our sovereignty, our rights, and our independence must be respected, end quote, he said in a video posted to Instagram. Quote, all states have an obligation to protect civilian life, and no state has the right to wage aggressive war, end quote. So as was mentioned, that was Will Greaves, and I don't agree with Will's politics. I don't agree with his policies, but Will, this is what conservatives have been trying to say and call out Mark Carney on. It's rules for thee, but not for me. So he's essentially saying, well, you know, we're standing up for Canadian sovereignty and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, sure. We support the United States going into another country. And this is the hypocrisy. This is the silliness that is coming from Mark Carney, and this was the problem with the Davos speech. Yeah, sure, you want to say all kinds of words, and you want to position yourself as, this is a great idea that I'm having, and we need to do this, and we need to do that. And we can't rely on the hegemonic powers and the superpowers. You know, we can't be pushed around by them, blah, 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 blah. Whereas he just signed a deal with China, because you're trying to get away from a superpower, so you signed a deal with a superpower. Got it. Never mind that the superpower that you signed on from is the one that's actively interfering within our country, who is harassing, extorting, and hurting the diaspora community in Canada. The United States, to the best of everybody's knowledge, isn't doing that. But the United States is the problem. Remember that poll that we put up where it shows that the vast, 49% of Canadians think that the United States is the biggest threat to world peace. Yet all these European countries don't come to that conclusion in the slightest. So, but the fact that Stephen Guilbeault liked that post and a couple of other Liberals liked that post, and there's more that have come out of the woodwork and are talking to newspapers now. Liberal MPs offer differing views on Carney's support for U.S. attacks on Iran. Liberal MPs are offering varying perspectives on Prime Minister Mark Carney's decision to voice his support for U.S. and Israel attacks on Iran that threaten to spill into a wider regional war. One Liberal MP told iPolitics the Prime Minister is in a quote-unquote very difficult place where he needs to manage his relationship with U.S. President Donald Trump with support for the rules-based global order. The MP, who asked not to be identified to share their concerns freely, said it's clear the U.S. and Israel are, quote-unquote, not following the UN Charter rules or international law, end quote, but Carney is likely, quote, very nervous about saying something that would get the ire of President Trump, end quote. That's a Liberal MP that is saying this, folks. The MP added that the Liberal caucus has, quote-unquote, mixed feelings on Carney's response to the U.S. attacks, with some worried about the precedent it sets for future intervention. Quote, I think there are a lot of people who maybe disagree with the U.S. invasion on a principled basis when it comes to international law, but they don't like the Iranian regime, and they don't like what they're doing to the Iranian people or to Iranians in Canada, end quote. They said, comparing it to the U.S. controversial capture earlier this year of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, who Canada regarded as an undemocratic dictator. Hanging over everything is the PM's much-discussed speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos earlier this year. In that speech, the Prime Minister said Canada would take a pragmatic approach to an increasingly volatile global environment and aim to partner with other middle powers to resist bullying from hegemons. Carney said Canada would still be guided by core fundamental values, including sovereignty and territorial integrity, and the prohibition of the use of force, except when consistent with the UN Charter and respect for human rights. The MP said Carney needs to explain to Canadians what that looks like in action. So, Carney's Liberals aren't too happy. And you have one of Carney's Liberals basically saying that he's afraid of Donald Trump. What's going on? I think everybody remembers when Carney said, we can handle Donald Trump. I know how to deal with Donald Trump. Then he backed down on his tariffs, backed down on everything else, seems to have terminated any desire to talk to Donald Trump, because as long as Donald Trump is the boogeyman, he thinks he can stay high in the polls. But now you have a Liberal MP basically saying that Mark Carney is afraid of Donald Trump. Fascinating. You know, when Mark Carney stands next to Donald Trump, he's like slunched over and, you know, he's been compared to Mr. Burns, and you can agree or disagree with that all you want, but it doesn't seem like this guy has the spine. And we've talked about this before as well. People are like, oh, it's all strategy. It's all strategy. Well, here's a Liberal MP that is talking in confidence because they don't want Mark Carney to get angry at them. And they're essentially saying that Mark Carney is afraid of Donald Trump. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we don't need a leader that is afraid of Donald Trump. We need a leader that Donald Trump respects. And Donald Trump respects strength. He may not agree with the person, but he can respect them. And we've seen that play out the world over. So I hope Canadians are starting to wake up and realize that not only does the left seemingly now not like Mark Carney around the world, which is the arena that he always goes off to in order to try and get some political points, but now the international press is catching on that he's not the guy that he's been advertising that he is. Hopefully, Canadians are starting to see the same thing and realize that this guy is not the guy that can handle Donald Trump. This guy is not the guy that can stand up to Donald Trump, because all he's done is stood down and knelt down. And his own Liberal MPs are now saying in confidence, so there's no risk to them, that they think that Mark Carney is actually afraid of Donald Trump.